Good morning. Those of you who attended the final church service of last year, either in the building or on Zoom, the annual poetry service, got a special treat when Mike Flanagan recited one of his favorite poems. It's called One Art, and it's by Elizabeth Bishop. It's written in a tricky verse form called a villanelle, which requires repeating certain lines multiple times in different contexts as the poem moves on. Probably the most famous villanelle in English is Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night," in which the title line and the second line are the ones that get repeated. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. In Bishop's poem, the key line is this one: the art of losing isn't hard to master. Using that line as a hinge, she traces all the losses of her life, from the small to the great, and in each case, she tells us, the art of losing isn't hard to master. Car keys, people's names, places you meant to travel, all are easily lost. And then she raises the stakes: a house, a city. But still, the reassuring line comes in at the end of the stanzas like a tolling bell. The art of losing isn't hard to master. In the final stanza, she writes of life's greatest loss, losing a loved one. And here the cracks in her false bravado finally show. Here's the complete poem. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch. And look, my last, or next to last, of three loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I loved, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. It's that write it that gives it away. Losing is hard to master. In fact, it's practically unbearable sometimes. And although it's not an especially pleasant subject, it's one that we should probably think about from time to time. 4 years ago this month, the first deaths in the continental United States from COVID-19 occurred. It doesn't seem all that long ago, and yet it seems like an eternity. The past 4 years introduced us to loss on a scale we weren't used to. And I'd have to say that as a nation, we didn't handle it all that well. The thing I remember most about the early months of the pandemic was the pervading sense of dread. For the first time in my personal memory, we faced a disease that was mysterious and often fatal, and for which the usual methods of treatment didn't seem to work. I remember the great run on ventilators, with people patching together makeshift versions out of what seemed like spare vacuum cleaner parts. And then the mania for hand sanitizer. Sharon and I had planned a trip to see Anna that spring, and after much debate and doubt, we put together a travel regimen that included no face-to-face interactions with anyone, spray bottles of alcohol, and several sorts of wipes. And after the dread came the months of deaths. Earlier generations had experienced massive nationwide pandemics before. I recall hearing my parents talk about the all-consuming fear they felt before polio was finally brought under control. And my grandparents had vivid memories of the so-called Spanish flu of their younger years. But for me, who had grown up as a typical optimistic American, with the ingrained belief that throwing enough ingenuity and technology at a problem would inevitably solve it, this new situation was profoundly disturbing. Refrigerator trucks being pressed into service as makeshift morgues, nightly death counts on the evening news, doctors and nurses in combat mode, and worst of all, the seemingly endless and random succession of lost lives. Friends, neighbors, loved ones, hardly a family in America was left untouched. Compounding the loss was our national response. For many people, COVID was accompanied by a stigma and a perception of politics. This attitude fostered a culture of denialism and wishful thinking among many people, which only complicated efforts to control the spread of the disease. The elected coroner of Cape Girardeau County in southeast Missouri, for example, would only list COVID as a cause of death if a family asked for it, claiming that he didn't want to offend their sensibilities. And many families said they appreciated that. But But beyond the loss of lives, this pandemic cost us other things, maybe just as important in the long term. One thing I remember vividly from my parents' stories about the polio epidemic was the immense sense of relief and gratitude they felt when it was announced in the 1950s that a vaccine had been developed. First, the Salk injection, and later the Sabin sugar cube. Initially, we saw something similar during COVID. You remember the waiting lists, the rumor mill, the stories of people driving 50 miles, 100 miles, once they had gotten on some health department's approved list for a vaccine. Sharon was working for the MU Health Department, Service at the time, and recalled many people bursting into tears when they finally reached that head of the front of the line to get their shot. But before long, people who had been conditioned by demagogues in the media to do their own research and to reflexively distrust their government mobilized against the vaccine, promoting alternative treatments of little or no value. This breakdown in trust continues to this day, and it has spread into a wider breakdown of trust in the whole social compact. Anti-government rhetoric that would make an anarchist blush is now routine. In my home state of Missouri, it's a powerful force in the government. We have the peculiar situation of people in government telling us not to trust the government. That's unsustainable in the long run. But right now, and probably for a long time to come, a lot of Americans would not agree with the statement, "We're all in this together." I hope and believe that someday our social fabric will be mended. But right now it is torn. And as we all know, even after a fabric is mended, you can still see the place where it tore. This loss of faith has tangible consequences. Public health experts estimate that of the roughly 1.1 million Americans to date who have died from COVID, about 200,000 of them died because they voluntarily chose not to be vaccinated after a vaccine was available. A friend of mine used to argue, not entirely facetiously, that these deaths should be counted as suicides in our national statistics. There's a deep moral cost here. In addition to that social loss, I feel that we've lost something on a more personal level. Let me give you an example. One of our neighbors is a retired couple, sweet people who love their kids and their dog and fuss around in their yard just like us. But they're also among the millions who've gone down the anti-mask, anti-vax, ivermectin, conspiracy thinking road. And true to form, they've both had COVID a couple of times, once nearly fatal. And of course, they've received the same exemplary medical treatment that I would expect if I ever had to go to the hospital, despite the fact that in my mind, they've brought their troubles onto themselves. But now when I look at them, I don't see the same eccentric but harmless people I saw before. There is a veil between us. I no longer trust them. I no longer trust their judgment or common sense. And I'm not sure whether that trust will ever come back. These smaller breaches are a mirror of the larger social disruptions I mentioned, but somehow I feel them differently because they're right in my literal backyard. And no, they haven't changed their ways. Another personal loss that I think we all felt but perhaps didn't notice was the inability to properly grieve those we lost during that time. Not just those lost to COVID, but those who died for other reasons but disappeared among the lockdowns and quarantines. We had a good friend named Dwayne Daly who died in March 2020 at the age of 84, not from COVID. Dwayne had a long and rewarding career with the University of Missouri Extension Service. He produced articles and photographs of exceptional quality, specializing in Missouri agriculture, particularly mules, wonderful photos of mules. But when he died, we were in the midst of the height of the lockdown. So no services were ever held. The funeral home in his North Missouri hometown took charge of arrangements, but with no opportunity to gather, those arrangements never panned out. Ecclesiastes tells us that there is a time to mourn and a time to dance, but he doesn't give any advice about what to do if you've missed your time. A death is always a shock, with someone there one day and then not there the next. But a death without recognition seems exceptionally difficult. It was as if my friend had just been swallowed up by the earth without so much as a chance to wave goodbye. All of this adds up to a sense of dislocation in our lives. We've begun to start dating things as before COVID and after COVID, like people used to do when they would say before the war and after the war. And even in myself, I feel a kind of amnesia taking hold about that first year. A while back, I read Charles Finch's book, What Just Happened. Finch had the good idea of keeping a day-to-day diary of his impressions and feelings during the first year of COVID, which was also, as we remember, the year of unrest after the killing of George Floyd, and the year of a chaotic and disturbing presidential election. Finch's daily recollections brought home to me the sense of paranoia and constant uneasiness that characterized the year. He summed up 2020 in one short sentence: don't go anywhere and be afraid. That's not a way to live one's life in the long run. And I think that many of us are still in the process of climbing out of that foxhole. But how do we do it? How do we get back to something that passes for normal after such a siege? Toward the end of George Bernard Shaw's play, Major Barbara, Barbara's father tells her, "You have learnt something." That always feels at first as if you had lost something. And I think now we're in the reverse position. We've lost a lot, and losing feels unbearable. But we have no choice but to bear it. The question is, will we learn from it? I've always hated to lose. When I was in the 8th grade, I took part in the annual spelling bee, sponsored in Missouri by the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. That tells you how long ago it was. I won the regional round and got to go up to St. Louis for the statewide match. The winner would get a trip to Washington, D.C. for the national spelling bee. There were about 20 of us kids, and we spelled and misspelled until there were only 2 left. Myself and another 8th grader, also, I think, who was from St. Louis County. I don't remember much about the match, to be honest. The only things I remember are the word that knocked me out: sesquicentennial. And the word that they gave the other kid, which he spelled correctly to win the trip to Washington: receipt. I mean, come on. Everybody can spell receipt. So as you can see, losing haunts me. But you know what? I have never misspelled sesquicentennial again. There is learning in loss, if only we can see it. So what have I learned from this season of losses? Well, I'd start with some of the observations I mentioned earlier, that people do not always rise to the occasion in times of crisis. When I think about my neighbors, who are people who held responsible jobs with significant organizations, I am struck by how easy it is to let your preconceived ideas and prejudices get in the way of clear thinking. But the thing is, I didn't always make the best decisions myself. And maybe the larger lesson is not to be so quick to judge. Carelessness and self-interest are not just the property of those people out there. We would do well not to forget that. I've also learned that we need each other in the most profound and basic ways. Confronted with isolation, people created ad hoc social circles to compensate. Socially distanced conversation circles in the park, small pods of trusted friends, and of course the ever-present Zoom chats. People came up with all kinds of ways to stay connected. We need each other. And finally, I learned that we need to grieve our losses properly. Forgetting is not the lesson to be learned from COVID. When I was a kid, there were a lot of people around who had lived through the war, as they all called it. But many of them were reluctant to talk about it because it was so painful for them. Fortunately, enough historians and storytellers did take up that burden of the memory of the war and what it cost the world. And that story has stayed alive. I hope the same is true with COVID. We are going through a phase now of sorting through the broken parts of our lives, figuring out what can be rescued or repaired, and what has to be left behind. We can remember that beautiful mosaics and stained glass windows are built from broken pieces. But that doesn't make the process of sorting any easier. The art of losing is hard to master, but it's a necessary one.